All right, folks, welcome. Sorry to blast your eardrums out there. So what we're going to do right now is just quickly go around the room and have everybody introduce themselves. If you could just give us your name and maybe a very, very quick explanation as to why you're here. So why don't we start right here?
Hi, I'm Ryan Connery. I'm with the Salem Historical Society. This is my 5th history camp, and I'm here just because it's, I think, the best conference of the year.
I'm Barbara Mee. I just retired last June after 33 years of teaching in Londonderry, New Hampshire social studies at 8 Mass, and I'm going to keep my certification up, even though I think I've done something interesting I've never done before.
Good for you. Yes, ma'am. How about right here?
I'm Colleen. This is my 2nd history camp, and I'm here just because I like history.
Good reason.
I'm James. I'm a junior at Suffolk, and I'm a history minor, so that was a good fit. Jim Walsh. I'm from Marlborough. Just history, political enthusiast. So.
Excellent.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Raker. I am a junior at Salem State, and I'm studying public history. This is my 1st history camp, and I'm actually presenting today at the 4:45 p.m. slot. So,
Excellent.
are we introducing ourselves? Sorry.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Sharon Perry. I sit on the board of directors at the Boring Greenhouse, which is an 18th century structure in New Clay, Massachusetts, and I also work in collection services, PBS Museum, doing registration and conservation. This is my 1st history camp. So
Excellent.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Clark. I'm also with the Loring Greenhouse on the board, and I do community education programs, among other things. And I would love to present here. This is my 2nd history camp, so I'll get around to preparing something. And I'm also editorial services manager at Historical England.
Nice. Great. Why don't we start down here and work our way up, ma'am?
Hi, Ellen Miller. I'm with the Hingham Historical Society, and I'm the chair of the House Committee of the Old Ordinary, which was built in 1688 as our house museum. This is my 1st history camp, and I'm very excited to be here.
Great.
My name is Jean Brack, and I'm from Middleton, Massachusetts. I'm a retired reference librarian, and I've been researching and writing about women on April 19th, 1775.
I'm Carl Tiska, retired naval officer and a colleague of Stevens at the Naval War College, and I'm just a huge history enthusiast.
Doug Hancher, I'm also a retired naval officer, 2nd career as a structural engineer and a history buff as well as a Naval War College.
Yes, sir.
My name is Tom Edley. I'm from Boston and just love history and reading about history.
Great.
1st history camp.
I'm Carrie Ann Whitworth, my 3rd history camp. I teach U.S. History 1 to 1877 and Intro to Psychology at Avon Middle High School.
Thanks. Great.
Mary Mercier from Hanson, social worker, over 40 years in mental health. But I grew up in Michigan, and when I came to Boston as a college student, as a college student in the state, I was so amazed with all the history that's all around us. And I love history, and this is my pleasure.
Great.
Miriam Bogan. I was a history major, and I was a librarian in New York State. Just moved here in September, and very excited about living in the Boston area, and it's my 1st history.
Nice.
Sam Bogan, also a history major. Spent most of my career with the New York State Office of Cultural Education and the New York State Archives as chief of staff.
Great.
I'm Elizabeth Foreman. This is my 1st history camp. I'm an independent scholar in world history. I recently stopped teaching high school.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Ellen Moravian, 3rd history camp. I'm a volunteer for Boston by Foot and Nichols House Museum, and I give tours for cruise ship people and Airbnb experiences.
Nice.
Jack Rubin, Wellesley, 2nd history camp, just interested in history.
Great.
Renee Rubin, 2nd history camp. Originally in education as a principal for many years and just love history.
Good.
Bruce Bellison, I'm with Wellesley Weston Lifetime Learning. In retirement, I'm enjoying history, and so much so that I organized a history course, and Steve will be one of our speakers later this.
Looking forward to it.
Good morning, Steve.
Good morning.
Hi, I'm Cynthia. I live in South Boston. I teach in East Boston history and social studies to adults who are studying for their high school equivalency exam.
Barbara Kurz, I'm a preservation planner, excuse me, for the city of Newton, and I'm also the caretaker at the James Blake House, the 1661 house in Dorchester, oldest surviving house in Boston, and we are in fact open for tours tomorrow, 11 to 4.
Nice.
Eric Bauer, archivist for the Peabody Institute Library in Peabody, Mass. Also the archivist, the archives manager at the Haverhill Public Library, and I'm adjunct at Salem State University where I teach public history courses, in addition to my independent consulting that I do. This is my 7th history camp, and I will actually be presenting today at 10:45 on the controversial topic, are museum objects still necessary?
Great.
John Payne, I grew up in Boston's historic North End, spent a lot of times as my boyhood in Hawaiian sides and the Bunker Hill Monument on hot days. Nice cool breeze up there.
Nice. Ma'am?
Hi, I'm Linda McIver. I started out as a high school teacher in New Hampshire, moved to Boston, ended up in library science at Boston Public Library's research library in social sciences. Retired 2 years ago, and now my last love, I think, other than history, I teach genealogy classes and lecture genealogy topics.
Great.
My name's Pamela Laux, and I live in Providence, Rhode Island, and I'm new to New England, so I'm interested in history and New England history.
Terrific.
Jean Eckert, outreach coordinator for the Dorothy Quincy Homestead in Quincy.
Yes, sir.
My name is Matthew Leese. I'm a former warehouse worker who just returned to college and graduated with my master's in December in history, and this is my first history.
Nice. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Lorna Hainsworth. I'm from the Baltimore, Maryland area. I'm the one that you heard about. There's been 6 of these already. Today, I would like all of you to consider coming to my presentation at 2:45 in room 275. And there you will learn how the National Road became the National Pike. See you there.
Mark Lonergan, I'm interested in history, and I live about a mile from where Abigail Adams was born.
Nice.
My name's Carla Myers. I live next to him, so I live a mile also.
In the same house, by the way.
I work at Logan Airport, and I just enjoy history.
Great.
I'm Marianne Kaderis, a retired interior designer who specialized in historical renovation, so that was great. I've always been a history buff, and about 3 years ago, someone gave me, my daughter gave me a history nerd mug. Well, I needed to get more, and when I received them, Lee had sent not only a thank you note, but an invitation letting me know about history. Since I've embraced my inner nerd, I have met so many fantastic people. This is my 2nd history camp, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Right.
And she brought us.
Yes, I did.
Very good.
I'm Anderson. I'm a high school intern at Hingham Historical Society.
I'm Emma, and I'm also a high school intern at the Historical Society.
Great.
I'm Judy. I live in Cambridge, and I'm interested in daily life in colonial times, and I volunteer as a knitter for Plymouth Plantation, and we knit the garments of the English villagers wear.
Nice. Nice.
My name is Justina Chu. I moved to live in Boston about 5 years ago, right on the Freedom Trail. And then I started to work in this building. So everything is centered around here. And that's when I started to learn about American history and got so interested in it, so many things to learn and just right around us. So this is my 2nd year here in history. I'm affiliated with the Chinese Historical Society of New England.
Nice. Excellent. Oh, well, thank you. I think we got everybody except maybe.
One lady.
Ma'am.
I'm Judy Rod.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you all. So my name is Steve Knott. I teach at the Naval War College with people like Carl. And I've been there since 2007. I got my PhD at Boston College, not in history, but actually in political science. But I've always been interested in American history and see myself as kind of a closet historian. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on how early American presidents used covert operations, going back to George Washington, his use of those operations during the Revolutionary War, but also how they incorporated that tool into the new government, the new presidency under the Constitution. And of course, one of the key figures in that, setting that government up, particularly setting up the Washington administration, was Alexander Hamilton. So my second book was about Alexander Hamilton's reputation, his place in the American mind, if you will. And I wrote that book in 2002, so I want to make it clear, I was on the Hamilton bandwagon long before it became the in thing to do, long before Lin-Manuel Miranda, actually long before Ron Chernow wrote his book. In fact, Chernow relied to some extent on the work that I did in my book, so I just want to throw that in there. And then I went on to write another book about the relationship between George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, which I have argued, along with my co-author, have argued that that Washington-Hamilton relationship was the critical relationship, the critical alliance of the founding era. More so, I would argue, than Jefferson and Adams or Jefferson and Madison, which is not an argument that goes down well in certain circles. So I think I know Alexander Hamilton quite well. I've been looking at his life, his works, his writings for at least 25 or 30 years now. And so what I'm going to talk to you about this morning is the Hamilton image as it was first crafted by his opponents, who did a remarkable job, sort of, I would say, distorting Hamilton's real record. And then talking a little bit about Lin-Manuel Miranda and the musical, which I think has been terrific. It saved Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill. There's no question about that. When I first wrote my first Hamilton book, I had to explain to my mother who Hamilton was. And that was not an uncommon response back in 2002. Less so today, thanks to Lin-Manuel. And then I'm going to conclude with talking about what I believe to be the real Alexander Hamilton that has still, to some extent, it still hasn't taken root, what this man stood for. So let me begin by talking to you about Hamilton's reputation, and in particular how it was crafted by his opponents, especially in the Jeffersonian camp, but also to some extent by John Adams and his allies and his family members, who went on to write some interesting histories about the early republic. I'm sure you're aware Jefferson was the nation's first Secretary of State once he returned from Paris in March of 1790. Alexander Hamilton was the nation's first Treasury Secretary. He had been in place since September 11th, 1789. I mention those dates in part because that 5 or 6 month period that Hamilton was in place as a Treasury Secretary gave him an edge over Thomas Jefferson, who arrived later. And if you couple that with the fact that Washington and Hamilton had worked side by side during the Revolutionary War, and I mean literally side by side, where Hamilton was Washington's key staff officer for well over 4 years, writing many of Washington's orders and actually taking on a number of Washington's responsibilities as the war went on. Point being that the relationship between President Washington and Alexander Hamilton was already set. It was a strong one, whereas Washington and Jefferson, who knew each other but not all that well, there was a bit of a steeper hill to climb, perhaps, for Thomas Jefferson, who, as I mentioned, also arrives 5 or 6 months into the administration. Very quickly, Hamilton and Jefferson begin to butt heads over all sorts of issues. The National Bank, the assumption of the various debts that were left over from the Revolutionary War era, the location of the nation's capital, just general economic policy that Hamilton favored a kind of more of a vigorous, dynamic capitalist system, Jefferson perhaps favoring the status quo, particularly the slave economy in the South. All sorts of issues, foreign policy issues as well, including the correct approach towards the French Revolution. Should the United States, how deeply involved should the United States become in supporting this new revolutionary government in France? All of those things began to sort of rip Washington's cabinet apart. Washington tried as best he could to sort of breach to heal the divide. And we can talk perhaps in the question and answer period as to why those efforts failed. But the point being, very, very quickly into Washington's presidency, there really was this very deep divide. And Hamilton and Jefferson grew to, I don't think it's an overstatement, grew to hate each other fairly quickly. And what this meant was, at least in terms of the crafting of Hamilton's reputation, Jefferson began to use the press, to use surrogates, in a sense, to craft Hamilton's image, to portray him as somehow un-American. He was not born here. He was born in the Caribbean on the island of Nevis. He was an immigrant. There was this kind of nativist, this guy's somehow un-American thinking that you see permeating a lot of the criticism of Hamilton in the press during the 1790s. Now, Hamilton punched back as well, and he had his own newspaper allies. Although I will say this for Hamilton, I think generally speaking, he tried to keep the debate focused on policy, not on personalities, but he did not succeed in that. And the image that the Jeffersonian press, and I'm talking about people like James Callender, who for a time was on Jefferson's payroll secretly, the image that was crafted of Alexander Hamilton, as I said, was he's not one of us. He's got these alien, exotic ideas. He's probably a monarchist. And he's certainly cozy with a kind of East Coast plutocratic elite. And he really, at its core, does not share the principles of 1776. This intensifies throughout the 1790s. And I've argued in my books that Alexander Hamilton was really the first victim of the politics of personal destruction. Again, I'm biased towards Hamilton, I'll confess that. But I do think you'd be hard-pressed to find the same level of personal assaults directed against Jefferson during the 1790s. I'm not talking about when he becomes president. There's just not that same level of personal invective directed against Hamilton. Just to give you an example, it's the Jeffersonian press, it's James Callender, who releases the fact that Alexander Hamilton had had an extramarital affair with a woman named Mariah Reynolds. That Reynolds affair, at the point at which it became printed in the media, was a 4 or 5 year old story. But it was published in 1797, I'm convinced in part to prevent Hamilton from running for president in 1800 against Jefferson. But whatever the motives for releasing it, it comes out of James Callender's press. He's a Jeffersonian surrogate. And this is what I mean by this attempt to destroy Hamilton. The Jeffersonians thought that they were on to a financial scandal. They assumed that there was somehow some sort of insider trading going on in the Treasury Department. In fact, what they got onto was a case of adultery and a case of an adulterer making payments to Maria Reynolds' husband to hush up the whole thing. Not a high point in Hamilton's career, for sure, but it shows you the extent to which the Jefferson coalition was willing to sort of punch below the belt to finish off Hamilton. And then you see this progress even into Jefferson's presidency, where he orders his Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, to comb through the Treasury files from the 1790s to find evidence of this financial misconduct that all good Jeffersonians were convinced must be there. And when Gallatin reported back to Jefferson that he didn't find anything, it just was further evidence to Jefferson of how crafty Hamilton was. I think we can safely assume that when Alexander Hamilton was killed in the duel with Vice President Aaron Burr in July 1804, that there had to be some, and I'm sticking my neck out here, but some sense of relief on the part of Thomas Jefferson that in one fell swoop, two of his key opponents were eliminated. One was killed and the other was finished politically, Burr. Burr lives for another 30 years or so, but he's done as an American political figure. But it's interesting to look at the reaction of the Jeffersonians when Hamilton was killed. This spin campaign that I've been talking about, to portray Hamilton as un-American or a monarchist or a plutocrat, it doesn't stop after Hamilton is killed. There are efforts made to prevent the building of a statue in New York City to Hamilton by, as one of Jefferson's operatives put it, the English interest. There was a real concern that there would be an emotional reaction in favor of the Federalists due to the death of their leader in the 1804 elections. They were, I think, overstating that. In New England, Hamilton's death was deeply mourned. New York, of course, a little bit in the mid-Atlantic states. But the further south you went and the further west you went, Hamilton's death was welcomed. And to give you some evidence of that, when Aaron Burr eventually makes his way west, he's treated as a hero in Tennessee by none other than Andrew Jackson, who hosts Hamilton's murderer, has a great dinner for him. There's a sort of parade greeting Burr as he arrives. This is a guy who's basically on the lam for murder. So Hamilton was not a revered figure in the South and the western part of the United States at that time. Point being that this image of Hamilton that the Jeffersonians crafted, plutocratic, dictatorially inclined, not quite one of us, hated the common man, allegedly referred to them as a great beast, which, by the way, is, I can say with 99.9% certainty, a comment he never made. But if you Google Alexander Hamilton and great beast, it'll still pop up. All of these kinds of disinformation, or maybe we would say fake news, became part of the lore of the early republic. These myths, and most of them are myths, are given sort of renewed life by President Andrew Jackson during his battle with the Bank of the United States in the so-called bank wars of the Jackson era. Because it was Hamilton's baby, the Bank of the United States, even though President Washington was the one who proposed it and signed it into law. Hamilton always took the heat for Washington, by the way, on a lot of these controversial issues, which is an important thing to note. But Jackson uses Hamilton's association with the bank to go after his political opponents in the 1820s and 30s and accusing them of being Hamilton's heirs. They are the plutocrats of our time, of Jackson's time. The Whig Party, Henry Clay, and his proposal for internal improvements and his support of the bank, et cetera. It's evidence of Clay's plutocratic leanings and his corruption by the East Coast elites, of which Hamilton was the founding father of that East Coast elite. So the Jackson-Van Buren era is one where Hamilton's reputation, if it's possible, declines even further. Now, one thing interesting to note, Alexander Hamilton's widow, Betsy Eliza Hamilton, gets a lot of attention in the Miranda musical, rightly so. She outlives her husband by 50 years. So Alexander Hamilton is killed in 1804 in the duel with Burr. She dies in 1854. She actually is one of the last, if not the last, I would say the last living link to that whole founding generation. And she's 97 years old when she dies. And at this point, she's kind of a Washington celebrity because there aren't a lot of people around who could say that they danced with George Washington at Valley Forge during a winter in camp, you know. Pretty amazing story. So she's at all these state dinners with President Fillmore, President Polk. I mean, she is, I'm trying to think of somebody who might be the equivalent today. Well, she was sort of like the Alice Roosevelt Longworth of her time. She knew everybody. She was a walking encyclopedia of American history. She fights during these decades, the 50 years after her husband's death, to try to secure her husband's place in the American mind. And one of her key goals was to find somebody to write an official biography of her husband's life. And to show you just how difficult and perhaps how unpopular he was, it was a real struggle just to find somebody to do that. And she actually ends up selecting one of her own sons, John Church Hamilton, ends up writing this biography of his father, I think in the 1820s or 30s. It's not very good, unfortunately, but it's just a constant struggle on behalf of Eliza Hamilton and the Hamilton family to keep Alexander Hamilton's reputation sort of in the American mind and to commemorate it. Now, you do see a little bit of a reversal in terms of Hamilton's reputation around the time of the Civil War and during the so-called Gilded Age. Perhaps not surprisingly. You know, Hamilton had been the founding member of the New York Society for the Manumission of Slaves, along with John Jay in 1785. He had advocated for recruiting slaves in the South to fight for the Continental cause, for the American cause, in exchange for their freedom. He and his good friend John Lorenz had pushed this proposal. Hamilton had a good track record when it came to recognizing the revolutionary government in Haiti under Toussaint Louverture. He was a friend, in a sense, to the Haitian Revolution, to the first successful slave revolt, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, if not in the world. Hamilton helps to draft the Haitian Constitution of 1797, I believe. So his track record on racial matters is impressive. Plus, of course, he is, rightly so, seen as the centralizer of that founding generation. And it's Jefferson's states' rights doctrine and his nullification doctrine that he cozies up to in the late 1790s. If you think of it through the lens of the Civil War, it's perhaps no surprise that during this Civil War era and in its aftermath, Hamilton's reputation begins to rise and Jefferson's to decline. Now, I don't want to overstate this too much. It's not as if Abraham Lincoln was going around quoting Alexander Hamilton. In fact, he rarely quoted Hamilton and had a tendency to quote Jefferson. Although I've got a theory about that, which I think Lincoln understood if he could quote sort of the key Southern founder back to Southerners about the importance of equality, all men being created equal, that was an effective political technique to use against Lincoln's Southern opponents. But generally speaking, members of the new Republican Party and presidents like Benjamin Harrison, James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Rutherford B. Hayes, these men all have very, very positive things to say about Alexander Hamilton. And some of those that I just mentioned consider Hamilton to be the greatest of the founders. So there is a kind of resurrection of Hamilton's reputation in the Gilded Age. And then in the early 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt was a great fan of Hamilton's. Teddy Roosevelt despised Jefferson. But that's kind of it for Hamilton in the 20th century. Very quickly, with the rise of the progressive movement, progressive politics, Wilsonianism, and then, of course, the New Deal, those are Democrats. FDR, Wilson are Democrats. They embrace Jefferson. They kind of distort Jefferson. And they see Hamilton, to some extent, as the founding father of the modern Republican Party, even though he was long dead before the Republicans were created, because of Hamilton's association with capitalism, because of Hamilton's association with Wall Street, literally one of the founding fathers of Wall Street, because Jefferson and others had referred to Hamilton as a plutocrat. Wilson, FDR, and a number of Democratic Party figures during that era begin to see their Republican opponents as Hamilton's heirs, as the people who have a kind of contempt for the common man and lean towards Wall Street. And I'm not overstating this. I mean, it reaches the point in the 1930s where Alexander Hamilton might as well have been, Herbert Hoover. There's this blending of the two. FDR does a very remarkable job of pulling on that populist chord and making the argument that his party, going back to Jefferson, has always favored the common man. The Republican Party under Harding and Coolidge and Hoover is the champion of Wall Street, is the champion of the plutocrats. Now, it doesn't help Hamilton's cause that statue of Hamilton on the Treasury grounds in Washington, D.C., some of you may have seen it. It's on the backside of the Treasury, not on Pennsylvania Ave. And it's kind of walled off these days, unfortunately. That statue was erected by President Harding and Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon of the Mellon multi-billion-dollar, I think, Pittsburgh family, if I'm not mistaken. That symbolism could have been worse. I mean, could not have been worse. Harding, not exactly somebody who's going to make it up onto Mount Rushmore. Mellon, a plutocrat, if there ever was one, dedicating this statue to Alexander Hamilton in 1922. So again, during the build-up to the New Deal and within the New Deal itself, Hamilton becomes the symbol of all that was wrong about early America. And it may sound like I'm overstating this, but the one book review that Franklin Roosevelt ever wrote was a review of a book called Jefferson and Hamilton and the Struggle for Democracy in America. I don't recommend that you read this book, but it is a historic artifact of sorts. It was written by an Indiana journalist / Democratic Party operative named Claude Bowers, whom FDR will later appoint as his ambassador to Spain. And it's the most caricatured account of Alexander Hamilton you can possibly imagine. And Franklin Roosevelt loved it. There are sentences in this book by Bowers about how Jefferson saved the Republic from becoming a military dictatorship, or at times a plutocratic military dictatorship. The sage of Monticello was constantly battling Hamilton's elitist forces to preserve the rights of the common man, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And FDR wrote a review of this book in the mid-1920s under the interesting headline, "Is there a Jefferson on the horizon?" Which, of course, there was. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself. It's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading the book, but if you want to read FDR's review, it's an interesting case of how a political figure uses history, distorts history for propaganda purposes, and it worked to great effect. In 1928, at the Democratic National Convention, the keynote speaker for the Democratic Party was none other than Claude Bowers, author of Jefferson and Hamilton and the Struggle for Democracy in America. And then in 1932, when FDR is about to secure the nomination, he asks Claude Bowers to deliver his nominating speech. That's how big. This guy was sort of the Arthur Schlesinger of his day, a kind of historian, biographer slash activist. Bowers doesn't nominate FDR in 1932, but only because his boss at the New York World Herald or something says, no, you can't do that. It's a little too political. You're a journalist. But the point is, there's this real intellectual or semi-intellectual overlap between a group of historian and biographers who see Hamilton as the founding plutocrat and Jefferson as the champion of the common man. Bowers' work goes on to influence Dumas Malone. Some of you may be familiar with that name. Malone writes this Pulitzer Prize-winning 6-volume biography of Thomas Jefferson that starts, I think he started in the 1930s or 40s, and he finishes in the 70s. And Malone shares that same, in my view, caricatured view of Hamilton and Jefferson as the hero who saved the day and remained loyal to the principles of 1776. And that's pretty much how Hamilton's reputation proceeds throughout much of the 20th century. He is, I mean, it actually got so bad during the Second World War. I dug up some op-ed pieces and editorials where they'd invoke the Founding Fathers to sort of stir up patriotism, and they would have to add things like, and even Alexander Hamilton would have opposed the Nazis. Even Hamilton. I kid you not. This is how bad it was. He was really seen as a founding fascist in all good progressive circles. In my book, his popularity level was on par with Tokyo Rose in the 1940s. So we've come a long way. Now, how to explain that? How did we get to the point where we are today in the 21st century, where arguably Hamilton has eclipsed Jefferson in the American mind, arguably? What led to that before we dive specifically into Miranda and the musical? There were a couple things that began to happen in the late 20th century. Well, really, in some cases, going back to the 60s, and that is a renewed emphasis, maybe even finally, an emphasis on matters of race, of the importance of race in the history of this nation. And lo and behold, people began to look at Jefferson's record, Jefferson being one of the largest slaveholders in the state of Virginia, even Madison's record to some extent as a slave owner, versus Hamilton, who was this founding member of the New York Society for the Manumission of Slaves. Hamilton holds up pretty well when you contrast the Virginia, I'll use this term, slavocrats, with a founding member of the New York Society for the Manumission of Slaves, or somebody who advocated arming and equipping slaves in exchange for their freedom during the war. These were somewhat progressive positions taken for somebody who allegedly hated the common man. So a renewed emphasis on race, and I would even argue a kind of emphasis on immigration and the contributions that immigrants made to the United States. You begin to see historians, biographers, political scientists focus more on these kinds of issues. And what that does, I think, is elevate Hamilton's position in the American mind. And I have to say, there is a kind of iron law in American historiography, at least when it comes to the founding. As one of these guys falls, the other rises. It's just automatic. Jefferson and Hamilton are still battling each other. And that's a very simplistic approach, and it's something that I have to avoid doing because there obviously were all sorts of other factors involved in the founding. But it just seems to be true. As one of these guys falls, the other rises. And so you begin to see the work of people like Richard Brookhiser, a historian by the name of Forrest McDonald, a great historian in my view, writes a book, a biography of Hamilton in the 1980s, that really focuses on slavery, on Hamilton's economic views and how they represented a threat to the slave aristocracy. Just a different angle on all of it that moves away from this simplistic champion of the common man versus the plutocrat approach to American history. And McDonald and Brookhiser's work, and I would like to think maybe a little bit my own work, influences the biography that Ron Chernow writes of Alexander Hamilton, which comes out in 2004 and eventually makes its way into the hands of Lin-Manuel Miranda, and the rest is history. Let me talk a little bit about Miranda and the musical. How many of you have seen the musical? I figured it'd be a pretty good, yeah. I've seen it 3 times. My wife loves it. We've had to take out a couple mortgages on the house to buy the tickets, but it's worth it. Again, it's terrific. But I'm going to say some critical things, but I just want to make it clear. I've seen young people now develop an interest in this period of history, whereas prior to this musical, they could have cared less. So God bless Lin-Manuel Miranda. There are 3 areas, I think, where both Ron Chernow, who's sort of feeding the ideas to Miranda, missed the mark somewhat. The first is what we've talked about here, Hamilton's position on abolition and on slavery. Yes, as I've said, it's far preferable in my view. It comes off much better than the actions of Jefferson and Madison and some of the others. But he's not an abolitionist. He's not, an early version of Frederick Douglass. He's opposed to slavery. He dislikes it. It's my belief that he never owned slaves, although some historians push back on that. But in my view, the evidence is pretty overwhelming that he never owned slaves. However, he did, as an attorney, engage in transactions involving the sale of slaves, so he wasn't above doing that. So you could argue that he was part of the whole process that encouraged slavery. But again, he's not an abolitionist. He's anti-slavery. His record holds up well. I think there's a tendency, and maybe I'm reading too much into the musical, to portray Hamilton as more of an abolitionist than he was. And Miranda gets that from Ron Chernow. Now, there's an historian by the name of Joanne Freeman at Yale University who's made a very compelling argument. If abolition and slavery was really a major issue for Hamilton, we'd know it. I mean, it'd be crystal clear. Once he latched on to something, he latched onto it, and he didn't let go. You don't see that here. So I do think there's a tendency to overstate that, perhaps, in the musical. The other issue that I think is at least implied is Hamilton's immigrant status, and Hamilton being the champion of immigrants. Immigrants get the job done. Some great lines in the musical. Yes, Hamilton was an immigrant. However, he was not an advocate of open borders. He kind of went back and forth on the immigration issue. When he wrote his report on manufacturing in the 1790-91 timeframe, he talked about the need for having immigrants arrive to sort of man these factories. That was going to be important, and it might require a liberalization of immigration laws. But by the late 1790s, he's kind of reversed his position. And during the quasi-war with France, he sees something of a threat to American national security from immigrants, particularly from France, who might have sympathies for the French government at the expense of their new nation. And then in 1800, 1801, he argues against Jefferson's proposals to liberalize immigration laws, again on the same grounds, that what Jefferson's trying to do is bring in supporters of his party, of Jefferson's party, many of whom would be French, and that this would somehow represent a threat to American national security. So on abolition and on immigration, I think there's a little bit of a distortion in Lin-Manuel Miranda's depiction taken from Chernow. And then the final issue I'll mention, and this is my own little idiosyncratic objection. I think I've mentioned this before, and I can tell some people are like, why is he harping on this? But twice in the musical, in the hip-hop musical, there's a reference to Martha Washington having a kind of horny tomcat that she named Alexander Hamilton. Or Hamilton, sorry. And the only time in the entire musical where the Hamilton character sort of breaks out of character and looks at the audience and says, that's true, is after he says Martha Washington had this randy tomcat named Hamilton. It's not true. It's not true. Now, Miranda got this from Chernow, who got it from almost every biographer under the sun who's repeated this fabrication. Let me just say that the story about, now first of all, does that sound like something Martha Washington would do? Name her Randy Tomcat after her husband's closest aide? Anyways, you would not believe the number of biographers and prize-winning historians who have repeated this lie. And it goes back to, it first appears in the sometime in the 1780s in a British newspaper. And in addition to saying that Martha Washington named her Randy Tomcat Hamilton, it says that George Washington had 13 toes, one for each state. And things like that. Does that sound legit to you? No. And yet, and by the way, this is an interesting, it's a tiny little thing, but it's an interesting example of how myths get repeated. And nobody bothers to go back and check the original source. And I'm not going to name names, but it is amazing how many award-winning historians and biographers have repeated this myth. I actually tried to reach Miranda and kind of plead with him. I'm sure he's like, who is this lunatic? Could you just pull the that's true? I mean, you're talking about how important it is, who gets to tell your story. And here you are repeating this myth. But worst of all, saying that's true, but he begged off. He loved the story and thought it was too good, I guess, to pull. So it's still there. Again, that's a kind of minor thing, but it fits with part of what I started talking to you early this morning. These myths go back to the period when Hamilton was alive, and they were circulated by the Jeffersonians and the Adams folks, who also despised Hamilton. The Adams people were convinced that Hamilton was a serial adulterer. And so this tomcat myth fits perfectly with Abigail Adams' obsession with Hamilton's sex life, and John Adams' claim that Hamilton suffered from a superabundance of secretions that he had to drain off by visiting women of ill repute, as the phrase was used at the time. Yes, the man had an extramarital affair. I'm not up here excusing that. I'm sure it was incredibly destructive for his marriage, but he was not a serial adulterer, and unfortunately, this hip-hop musical perpetuates that myth. A couple final comments I want to get. How much time do I have? Well, I've got a lot of time, right? Okay. I want to get to your questions, but let me tell you who I think the real Hamilton was. And I've laid out some of his warts, but I do think on the whole, the record is pretty impressive. Yes, he did arrive here as an immigrant. It is in some ways a classic American success story, if you still believe in the American dream. Makes his way to George Washington's side. We're not entirely sure who brings Hamilton to Washington's attention, but on March 1st, 1777, he becomes a member of Washington's staff, and he's there pretty much for the duration of the war, and develops this rapport. They're not friends. There's an officer, there's a superior, and a subordinate there, but they develop this alliance. And they begin to see the world, I think, through the same set of eyes. They're convinced that the Articles of Confederation are a disaster. They're convinced that we might win this war, but even if we win the war, we could lose it all in the peace because of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Something's going to have to give. We're going to need a stronger central government, particularly when it comes to national security. So they're both on the same page there. And during the 1780s, in their view, in the view of Washington and Hamilton and Madison and others, things are starting to fall apart. And of course, it's Shays' Rebellion, not too far from here, that fuels that sense. And Washington and Hamilton are at the core of the effort to scrap the Articles of Confederation. They're at the core of the effort to draft the Constitution. Not that Hamilton was a key player in Philadelphia, he wasn't, but he was there. But he was certainly a key player in getting the Constitution ratified. And if New York State, his home state, had not ratified, that might have been the death knell for the entire constitutional experiment. He was critical in terms of getting that Constitution ratified in New York. And then as the nation's first Treasury Secretary, he and President Washington are devoted to, I think one of their top priorities was, as Hamilton put it, to convince their fellow citizens to think continentally, to think of themselves as Americans, not as New Yorkers, not as Virginians, but as Americans. And a number of small, might seem insignificant steps, but even issuing a Thanksgiving proclamation directed to the people of the United States of America, not to the states. Economic proposals designed to bind the people of the United States to this new central government. George Washington's tours of New England and the South were also designed to convince their fellow citizens to think continentally. Hamilton is in the thick of all of this. And the final thing I'll say before I get to your questions is Hamilton, and I think this applies to our situation today, Hamilton was devoted to the rule of law and very fearful of demagogues and populists who argued that they represented the true interests of the common man. Everything about Alexander Hamilton, from beginning to end of his career, he is devoted to the rule of law. When he's a young student at what is now Columbia University, a revolutionary mob, of which he was pro-revolution, but he prevented this mob from storming the president's house and attacking the Tory president of Columbia, King's College at the time. He's 18 or 19 years old, giving a speech on the steps of Miles Cooper's, the president's home, allowing that president enough time to sneak out the back window to avoid the mob. But it's to basically appeal to his fellow revolutionaries. This is not what we're about. We're not about mob justice. We're not a lynch mob. And you see that thread throughout his career. He represents, after the war, after he almost gives his own life in service to the revolution, he defends Tories from New York City whose property had been seized by the revolutionary, by people loyal to the revolution. And he argues on behalf of their property rights. So, and this thread continues until that day that he dies in Weehawken, or is shot in Weehawken, of a devotion to the rule of law, a fear of demagoguery, or as Hamilton put it, the little arts of popularity, and a devotion to a constitution that in some ways he didn't think was ideal. A lot of his proposals went nowhere. including a proposal to elect a president for life. Maybe that's a good one. That went down. But you know, I think we as Americans in 2019 still have much to learn from Alexander Hamilton, but it's going to require sort of pulling back on these myths that kind of enshroud his true record. Thank you. I'll take your questions now. On anything. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I attended a number of talks, and people that were there were members of the, I think it's called the Alexander Hamilton Society.
Yes.
And one of the people that was there was a lady. She's not a descendant of Hamilton, but she was married to a descendant of Hamilton.
Okay.
So her last name was Hamilton. And what she talked about is his birthplace. Now, about 25 years ago, I went to Nevis, and I'm not absolutely sure that I saw the house that he allegedly lived in or was born in. They're going to put a whole big museum thing up in Nevis regarding Hamilton. Is that true?
Well, there's already a small, I've never been, but I've seen, there's already a small museum there on the site of what they believe to be Hamilton's birthplace. But it's very tiny. Now, they may have more expansive plans than
Like they were going to
they probably do.
And like I say, 25 years ago when I went there,
Yeah.
It was like they were guessing that you sort of think this is where it is, you know?
Yes. Yeah, he wasn't on Nevis for too long. His more formative years were spent in St. Croix on the Virgin Islands. That's where his mother was imprisoned for adultery, you know, because her first marriage, just antiquated laws got her into trouble. He always carried that scar from his alleged illegitimate birth. And the fact that people like John Adams referred to him as the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler, you know, that kind of stuff stung, needless to say. So he came from the most dysfunctional background you can possibly imagine. His father runs off from the family when he's 8, 9, or 10. Mother dies a year or two later. He's handed off from one relative to another under very dire circumstances. By the time he's around 12 or 13, he's really fending for himself. And he actually ends up running an export-import firm, we'd call it today, in St. Croix. And he's like barking orders, you know, he's barking orders to these sea captains who are the toughest people on the planet as this tiny little pre-teenager. Anyways, incredible dysfunctional background. The fact that he made it out of all that is remarkable. Yeah. Yes, sir.
As you were speaking, I got to wondering why Hamilton is on a more significant bill than Jefferson. Thanks to Google, I could see that he's been on U.S. currency since 1861.
Yes.
Any significance to the fact that was during the Civil War?
I think so. I think so. I can't prove that conclusively. I've actually looked into this myself. You'd think the history of our currency would be a little more concise, but it's not. But I don't think it's an accident that in 1861 he's put on the currency. Again, he's the champion of the Union. I kept using the term centralized government. I should have said union. He's not a states' rights guy. And the fact that he's put on there in 1861, I'm sure is no accident. The fact that he almost was taken off a few years ago gave me some sleepless nights. But again, God bless Lin-Manuel. The Treasury came to its senses.
Yeah, what's the nub of the conflict between Hamilton and Jefferson? Is it a personality clash, a philosophical clash, or both?
It's everything you can think of. Sorry.
And I had a just follow-up question. If Jefferson was afraid of him running for president, but if Hamilton was not born in this country,
he could have run.
He could have run.
All those guys were grandfathered in at the Constitutional Convention. So legally, Hamilton could have run. There's no evidence that he was planning to run. But if you were a citizen at the time of the, I forgot what the date was, you were grandfathered in. So the clash between Hamilton and Jefferson, I emphasized the policy stuff, but there was more to it. They were, depending on when, we're not even sure when Hamilton was born. That's how obscure his birth was. It was either 1755 or 1757. I think it was probably 57. But anyways, so that puts there were 14 years between Jefferson and Hamilton. Jefferson was 14 years older. Jefferson's a Southerner, a gentleman. Everything you can imagine. Hamilton was brash. He had a tendency to let you know he was the smartest guy in the room. Jefferson was very reserved. Some people said almost shy. Didn't like public speaking. I don't think Hamilton had a problem with that. So in those cabinet meetings, you had the age difference. You had the Southern gentleman, the brash New York immigrant. And to be honest, I think Jefferson resented that Hamilton had fought at Washington's side during the Revolution when he, Jefferson, should have been tighter with his fellow Virginian, his fellow slave owner, and that the tightness didn't exist. And the more Hamilton is winning the policy arguments, the more resentful Jefferson is becoming. And trust me, Hamilton won almost every major dispute between he and Jefferson in the Washington. I mean, with one or two minor exceptions, Washington always tends to follow Hamilton's lead. That, I think, drove Jefferson crazy. Personality, policy, access to the president. And I'll add this, and I probably wouldn't say this in Virginia, where I lived for a time under false pretenses. Jefferson had a massive ego. Jefferson wanted to be president. Jefferson, I think, viewed his authorship of the Declaration of Independence as putting him in a position of importance that no other founder had. Again, most Jeffersonians would deny that. And I don't have a lot of evidence to support what I just said. But having studied Jefferson enough, the man had a titanic ego. I mean, anybody who takes the New Testament and applies a pair of scissors to it, cuts out all the miracles, and then dubs it the Jefferson Bible, i.e., I'm a better determinant, but you get the point. Yes, ma'am.
I find it interesting that your comments about Jefferson having someone look into the allegations of Hamilton's indiscretion, when now we know about his relationship with Sally Hemings, and
yes,
it just seems like total hypocrisy.
It's not so much that Jefferson had James Callender look into Hamilton's indiscretions. They had found out about this indiscretions with Maria Reynolds years earlier, not through anything Callender did. They used Callender to leak an old story to make it public. Now, the interesting thing is that this James Callender, 5 years later, will be the first journalist to publish the Sally Hemings stories. He turns against his benefactor, which I always thought was sweet justice. It's James Callender who really publicizes the Sally Hemings affair, whatever you want to, I'll leave it up to you how you want to characterize a master-slave situation. Callender was upset that Jefferson didn't make him the postmaster of Richmond, Virginia, and in retaliation, he publishes the stuff. So Callender was a scummy person, but Jefferson wasn't above putting him on his payroll if he could do what he wanted him to do. And by the way, Abigail Adams, Callender also published some very negative stuff about John Adams. Abigail Adams knew this and challenged Jefferson on it in a letter, and Jefferson flat out denied that he had anything to do with Callender or those stories. My take on Jefferson's character is not a positive one. He did some good things, but
I think if nothing else, the Hamilton play and the books and stuff at least made me and everyone else realize that something's really going to change.
yeah.
And I've often wondered, can you imagine
Oh, God.
Era of
Yeah.
the history of the
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
TV invasion, somebody texting, oh, we got there now. But that was one thing that kept coming out
Yeah.
in the play, in the books, was that, yeah, something's just.
The politics of the 1790s were savage, absolutely savage, and very personal. After the Reynolds affair was publicized, newspapers were taunting Hamilton's wife, just taunting her.
But historically, we've lost that. Everything was.
We tend to.
Until you dig into it.
Yeah, we tend to. Right. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
In the musical, they have it, it's all very dramatic that Hamilton is entering New York. Did he actually come to Boston?
He came to Boston first. Yeah. He was only here for a few days. I think it was that was the first available ship to get him to the States. He always intended to head south to New York. He wanted to get admitted to the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton. So that was his goal. So this was just a way station. I wish I could say he did more here, but he didn't. Now, interestingly enough, Boston becomes, in some ways, the capital of his base. Like, Boston is a Federalist town for quite some time, and Hamilton is a revered figure here. But his links to Boston are pretty limited. Yeah. Anything else before we, yes, ma'am?
I just wanted to make you feel better. In Hamilton, A Revelation, which is Lin-Manuel Miranda's annotated book of the play, book in theater terms being the script, he writes an annotation that says that the feral tomcat story isn't true. If you like the idea of Hamilton saying it's true because he's at the peak of his cockiness.
So I can claim credit for that. No, in all honesty, I just wish he had mentioned my name. I'm enough of a, well. Yeah. All right, folks, thank you very much. Thank you. Yes. 1772, 3. There you go.